The cold wind howled through the small town of Willow Creek, carrying with it the scent of autumn leaves and the distant sound of wind chimes. It was the kind of town where everyone knew each other, where children rode their bikes down quiet streets, and where the biggest crime in recent years had been a missing cat. But that peaceful image had been shattered a week ago when Emily Thomas, a bright and talented 16-year-old girl, was found dead beneath the Old Town Bridge. Her father, Thomas, sat motionless on the couch in their dimly lit living room, staring at the framed photo of his daughter on the mantelpiece. The house, once filled with laughter and warmth, now felt hollow, just an empty shell of what it used to be. The police had ruled Emily's death as a suicide. They said she had jumped off the bridge late at night, when no one was around to stop her. But something about that conclusion didn't sit right with Thomas. Emily had always been full of life. She loved painting, played the piano every evening, and dreamed of becoming an artist. She had friends, good grades, and an entire future ahead of her. Why would she suddenly take her own life? The authorities had given him an answer, but deep inside, a storm of doubt raged within him. It wasn't just his gut feeling. There had been signs, subtle yet chilling, in the weeks leading up to her death. 3 months ago, Emily had been the same cheerful girl he had always known. But then, something shifted. It started small nights where she barely slept, eyes shadowed by exhaustion, her hands trembling when she reached for her morning coffee. "Are you feeling okay, sweetheart?" Thomas had asked one morning as she sat at the kitchen table, absent-mindedly stirring her cereal. She had forced a smile. "Yeah, Dad, just a lot of schoolwork." But Thomas wasn't convinced. Over time, the signs grew worse. Emily began locking her bedroom door, something she had never done before. She flinched at unexpected noises. Once, he had walked into the living room to find her standing by the window, staring into the darkness outside as if searching for something or someone. Then came the whispers. One night, as he passed by her bedroom door, he heard her murmuring. Thinking she was on the phone, he knocked lightly. "Emily? Everything okay?" There was a long silence before she responded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah, just talking to myself." But it didn't sound like she was alone. When Thomas tried to press her for answers, she grew distant. One evening, he found her crying in her room, hugging her knees tightly. "Talk to me, sweetheart," he had pleaded. "Whatever it is, I can help." Emily hesitated before whispering, "Dad, have you ever felt like someone was watching you, even when you were completely alone?" His blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" he asked carefully. Emily shook her head quickly. "Nothing. I'm just being paranoid." Thomas wanted to believe that. He really did. But paranoia didn't explain the sudden bruises on her wrists, the way her hands trembled when she tried to drink her tea, or the shadow of terror in her eyes whenever she looked behind her shoulder. Something was wrong. The night Emily went missing was one Thomas would never forget. A storm had been raging outside, rain lashing against the windows as lightning split the sky. Thomas had been working late in his study when he heard the sound of the front door creaking open. "Emily?" he called out, walking toward the entrance. No response. He checked her room empty. Her bed was untouched, her phone still sitting on the nightstand. That was when the fear set in. She was gone. Frantically, Thomas searched the house, calling her name. When he stepped outside, the cold rain immediately drenched him, but he barely noticed. His only concern was his daughter. Neighbors helped him search, but there was no sign of Emily. Hours turned into an eternity. By dawn, the police had been called, but their search proved fruitless. Thomas was left with nothing but fear and the agonizing silence of an empty home. A week later, Thomas got the call. A jogger had found Emily's body beneath the town's old bridge. The sight of his daughter's lifeless form haunted him. Her once radiant face was pale, her lips slightly parted as if she had tried to call for help. The police concluded that she had jumped, citing the height of the bridge and the lack of any struggle. To them, it was an open and shut case. But Thomas couldn't accept that. There were bruises on her wrists, as if she had been restrained. There were scratches on her arms, as if she had fought against something. Most disturbing of all, her shoes were missing, Why would Emily remove her shoes before jumping? The officers dismissed his concerns, insisting that sometimes people in distress acted irrationally. But Thomas knew his daughter. He knew her habits, her fears, her dreams. And he knew Emily would never do this to herself. Something wasn't right. And if no one else was going to find the truth, then Thomas would do it himself, no matter what it took. The funeral was held on a cloudy afternoon, the sky heavy with the weight of an impending storm. Friends, family, and neighbors gathered in the cemetery, all dressed in black, their faces marked with sorrow. A priest spoke softly about Emily's kindness, her passion for art, and the unfulfilled dreams that had been tragically cut short. But Thomas barely heard him. His mind was elsewhere. As he stood near his daughter's coffin, his fingers gripping the edges of his coat tightly, his eyes were drawn to Emily's wrists. The funeral home had dressed her in a delicate white dress, her hands folded over her chest, her face peaceful. But beneath the makeup, he could still see them, bruises, faint but undeniable, dark rings wrapped around her slender wrists, almost like restraints. A cold chill ran down his spine. The police had been quick to dismiss his concerns, labeling the bruises as insignificant, possibly caused by the fall. But Thomas knew better. These marks looked too precise, too deliberate. It was as if Emily had been held down, forced, before her life was stolen from her. He took a shaky breath, his mind racing. What if Emily hadn't jumped? What if someone had pushed her? The thought made his stomach churn. He had spent the last week questioning everything. The way Emily had changed in her final days, the fear in her eyes, the whispers behind her locked door. He had told himself it was grief clouding his judgment, that the police knew what they were doing. But standing here, staring at his daughter's lifeless body, he knew one thing for certain. Something wasn't right. And if no one else was going to find the truth, he would. After the funeral service ended and mourners began to leave, Thomas remained. His heart pounded as he watched the coffin being lowered into the ground. He knew this was his last chance. The night before, he had made a decision. One that terrified him but left him no other choice. If Emily had been murdered, if someone had harmed her, there had to be proof. And if the authorities refused to look for it, then he would. That's why, hidden beneath the sleeve of his coat, he clutched a tiny hidden camera. It was small, barely the size of a coin, with night vision capabilities and a long battery life. He had purchased it in secret, hoping that if there was even the slightest sign of movement in that coffin, anything unnatural, he would capture it. It sounded insane. Even Thomas had questioned himself. What did he expect to see? Emily was dead. And yet, a voice deep inside him whispered, what if she wasn't alone in there? As the workers prepared to close the coffin, Thomas took a careful step forward. Under the guise of adjusting the flowers inside the casket, he quickly slipped the small camera between the folds of Emily's dress, making sure it was well hidden. He swallowed hard. His hands trembled. No one noticed. Within minutes, the lid was sealed shut. The casket lowered into the ground, and dirt began to cover it. His daughter was gone. But now, a part of him was waiting to see what the camera would reveal. That night, Thomas sat in his study, the glow of his computer screen illuminating his tired face. His hands hovered over the keyboard, his breath shallow. He had connected the camera's live feed to his laptop. The screen showed darkness, nothing but pitch black. Of course, what had he expected? He exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. Maybe grief had driven him mad. Maybe he was desperately trying to find something, anything, to explain his daughter's death. Hours passed. Midnight came. The only sound in the house was the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall. Then, at exactly 3:17 a.m., something changed. The screen flickered. At first, Thomas thought it was a glitch. He leaned in closer, his heart hammering against his ribs. And then he saw it. A slight movement, barely visible but unmistakable. The camera was in total darkness, buried 6 feet underground. There should have been nothing. No air, no light, no life. But the shadows shifted. Thomas's breath hitched. His fingers clenched into fists. Was it just the camera adjusting? Was it? And then he heard it. Faint, muffled sound. Like a whisper. His stomach twisted. He turned the volume up, straining to listen. First, it was just static. But then, through the garbled noise came something else. Something that should not have been possible. A voice. Weak, trembling, but undeniably real. "Daddy?" Thomas's blood froze. The voice was soft, fragile, and filled with terror. It was Emily's voice, and she was calling for him. Thomas's hands trembled as he sat in front of his computer screen, eyes locked onto the still image of the paused video. His heart pounded so hard it felt like it might burst from his chest. The voice, Emily's voice, had been weak, distant, yet unmistakably real. She had called out to him. But how? She had been dead for over a week. Buried, laid to rest. The coffin had been sealed shut. There was no possibility of survival. And yet, she had spoken. A shiver crawled down his spine as he forced himself to hit play. The video continued, at first showing only darkness. The faint white noise of the camera's night vision hummed through the speakers. Seconds turned into minutes, and then, a sound. Faint, shallow breath. Thomas's blood ran cold. And then, a scraping noise, soft at first, but growing louder. Fingernails against wood. The sound intensified, growing more frantic. Scratching, clawing. His stomach twisted into knots as he watched the darkness shift. A faint, ghostly glow from the night vision picked up the movement of a pale hand trembling in the blackness. Thomas let out a choked gasp. It was Emily. Her eyes were wide with sheer terror. Her lips parted as she tried to scream. But her voice was barely a whisper, lost in the suffocating air of the coffin. She was alive. She had been buried alive. On the screen, Emily's movements became more desperate. She pounded on the wooden coffin lid with what little strength she had. Her breathing was erratic, her chest rising and falling in ragged gasps. Panic filled her features as she realized the truth. She was trapped. Tears streamed down her pale cheeks. She scratched at the coffin's interior, her fingernails cracking against the hard wood. Small splinters lodged into her fingers, blood staining the surface. And then, in the dim glow of the night vision, she turned her gaze directly toward the camera. Her lips moved. Thomas turned up the volume, his entire body frozen with dread. She whispered, her voice barely audible. "Daddy, help me." Thomas felt bile rise in his throat. He wanted to scream, to reach into the screen and pull her out, to wake up from this nightmare. But the footage continued. Emily's breathing became shallower. Her movements slowed. The oxygen inside the coffin was running out. She pressed a trembling hand against the wood above her, her fingers barely able to move. And then, something changed. Just as Emily's strength seemed to fade, the video took a darker turn. The screen flickered. The scratching noises stopped. Emily's body went still, her chest barely rising. Her half-lidded eyes stared into the void, her expression frozen in exhaustion, until she flinched. A sudden, unnatural thump echoed from the coffin's interior. Something else was in there with her. Thomas's breath caught in his throat. Emily's tired eyes widened in horror. Her fingers twitched. Her entire body tensed as if she felt something touch her. And then, a shadow moved. The night vision struggled to capture the details, but there was no denying it. Something shifted in the cramped space of the coffin. A hand, pale with long, unnatural fingers, crept over Emily's shoulder. Her mouth opened in a silent scream. The camera glitched violently. Thomas jolted back in his chair. The screen flickered, distorting into static before flashing back to an image that made his blood run ice cold. Emily's face was contorted in terror, her eyes staring at something unseen just beyond the lens. And then, the hand yanked her backward into the darkness. Her body jerked violently before disappearing completely from view. The screen went black. For a few long seconds, there was nothing but silence. Then the camera emitted a high-pitched static noise. A low, distorted whisper crackled through the speakers. Thomas's hands shook as he turned the volume up again. And then one final message came through. A voice, But this time it was not Emily's. She was never yours to save. The screen shut off completely. Thomas sat there, frozen in horror. His daughter hadn't just been buried alive. Something had been waiting for her. And now it had her. The night had never felt colder. Thomas sat in his dimly lit living room, the glow of the paused video still flickering on the screen. His mind raced, replaying every horrifying moment he had just witnessed. Emily had been alive. She had fought to escape. And then, something had taken her. The words that echoed from the video's final moments still sent shivers down his spine. She was never yours to save. Who knows what had whispered those words? His hands clenched into fists. He couldn't sit still. He couldn't just accept this as a hallucination, as some bizarre trick of the camera. He needed answers. He needed to bring his daughter home. The following morning, Thomas stormed into the police station, carrying his laptop and a USB drive with the footage. This time, he wasn't going to be ignored. When he demanded to see Detective Harris, the officer in charge of Emily's case, his voice was sharper than ever. The detective, who had initially dismissed Emily's death as a suicide, raised an eyebrow at Thomas's agitation but finally agreed to watch the footage. As the video played, Harris's skeptical expression quickly shifted to one of shock. His eyes widened, his hand gripping the edge of the desk. By the time Emily's final moments played out, the clawing, the unseen force, the chilling whisper, Detective Harris visibly paled. This can't be real," he muttered, rubbing his forehead. "You tell me," Thomas growled, "because I saw it. I heard her. My daughter was alive, and something was in there with her." Detective Harris hesitated, but then, as if sensing the weight of what he had just seen, he let out a slow exhale and nodded. "I'm reopening the case." Within hours, a team was dispatched to the cemetery. The authorities, along with forensic experts, arrived with heavy equipment. Thomas stood there, his breath visible in the cold air as they worked to unearth his daughter's coffin. It took 4 hours to reach the casket. When the wooden box was finally lifted from the soil, everyone present felt a suffocating sense of dread. The coffin was damaged. Deep scratch marks covered the inside, clear evidence that Emily had fought desperately to escape. But there was something far more disturbing. The lid was broken from the inside, as if something had forced its way out. The medical examiner's face was pale as he pried the lid open. And inside, Emily's lifeless body lay there, just as expected. But she wasn't alone. Something was written on the interior of the coffin lid, scratched in deep, erratic marks. The words made Thomas's blood turn to ice. "He is watching." The case took an even darker turn when further investigations led the police to a terrifying discovery. Emily's death had been staged. An anonymous tip led officers to a notorious criminal, a man named Daniel Crow, a convicted murderer with a history of ritualistic killings. He had been released from prison only months before Emily's supposed suicide. Under interrogation, Crow admitted to abducting Emily. He had drugged her, making it look like she had taken her own life, before ensuring that she was buried alive. But then he laughed. "What's so funny?" Detective Harris demanded. Crow leaned forward, his expression dark and twisted. "You think I killed her?" he chuckled. "I only put her in the ground." The room fell silent. Crow's grin widened. "But I wasn't the one who took her." A sickening feeling twisted in Thomas's gut. "Then who?" Harris asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Crow's face turned serious. "Not who," he murmured. "What?" Days later, Thomas stood alone in the cemetery, staring at Emily's gravestone. Despite Crow's confession, despite the forensic evidence proving Emily had been buried alive, one question remained unanswered. Who or what had been in the coffin with her? And where was she now? Because deep down, Thomas knew one thing. Emily's body had been in that coffin. But the thing that had been buried with her was no longer there. The scratches inside the lid, the whisper in the recording, it had never been Emily speaking to him at the end. She was never yours to save. Those words haunted him, because maybe, just maybe, Emily had never been the only one buried that day. and now whatever had been in there with her was free. If you found this story shocking, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more terrifying real-life mysteries. What do you think really happened to Emily? Let us know in the comments below.